Mr. President, I'd like to speak on a separate issue and ask to be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've been coming to this floor for a long time. I know you're new to the body, and so you've been spared my speeches on the subject, talking about for-profit colleges. This is an industry, for-profit colleges, that lures students with flashy ads and misleading promises, gobbles up the federal loan and grant money that these students can bring to them, and then ends up producing students, if they're lucky enough to get a diploma, who can't find good-paying jobs. To understand the for-profit college industry in America today, you only need to know three numbers. And for those who are listening, this will be on the final. Here are the three numbers. 10% of high school graduates in the United States of America go to for-profit colleges. When you think of for-profit colleges, think of University of Phoenix, DeVry, Kaplan, for-profit colleges. There are a lot of them. 10% of high school students go to these schools. These schools, the for-profit schools, receive 20% of the federal aid to education. Why do they get so much if they only have 10% of the students? They charge so much. Their tuition goes through the roof. 10% of the students, 20% of the federal aid to education. But here's the number I don't want you to forget, 46. 46% of all student loan defaults are students of for-profit schools. What does that tell you? It tells you these students are getting in over their head. They're borrowing too much money. It tells you these students end up dropping out and unable to pay their loans, or end up with a worthless diploma and can't find a job. How can the United States Senate stand back and say, this is acceptable? For-profit colleges are the most heavily subsidized private companies in America today, the most heavily subsidized. Mr. President, in your home state and mine, we have some farmers. Our farmers get kicked around a little bit about all the federal money they receive. Our farmers don't hold a candle to the for-profit colleges and universities. These folks have developed siphoning money out of the federal treasury to an art form. The money that they pay the CEOs who engineer these arrangements is in the millions of dollars each year. All federal dollars, virtually all, 90, 95% federal dollars. How can you call yourself a private, for-profit company when 80 to 90% of your money is coming directly from the federal government? As a matter of fact, this industry, the for-profit college industry, if you just took the money we spent in subsidies to these schools, would be the 9th largest federal agency in Washington. And yet, many flinty conservatives who hate subsidies and hate deficits look the other way. Oh, it's a private company. Private company. 10% of the students, 20% of the federal aid to education, 46% of all the student loan defaults, and they're getting 80 to 90% from the federal treasury, and we're supposed to look the other way? Mr. President, from time to time, students come and sit in our galleries. Many of them are soon to graduate from high school. They will be inundated by these for-profit schools. As soon as you reach a certain age, you can't log on to your computer without these schools roaring at you about the great deals they have to offer. I take a look back in recent memory. They actually ran an ad here, Mr. President, before you were elected. And it was an ad that was on local television here. It showed a very attractive young lady in her pajamas. And she was lounging on her bed, and she had her laptop computer. And she said in this ad, "I'm going to college in my pajamas. I'm going to a for-profit college. I don't even have to get out of my pajamas. I can go to college." Mr. President, that's a bad joke. And unfortunately, too many young people are lured into this belief, I can just log on and get a degree. Well, it turns out many times it's too darned expensive, and it's worthless if you ever get it. The stories that have come to my office of young people who signed up for these for-profit schools and ended up with more debt than they could ever possibly imagine, they're horrifying. A 30-year-old young woman in the suburbs of Chicago, now living in her parents' basement with over $100,000 in debt and a worthless degree from Everest. No, this wasn't Everest College. I'll talk about those folks in just a moment. But she received a worthless degree from one of the for-profit colleges in the Chicagoland area. They told her, she'd watched all these crime shows on television, they told her she could go into law enforcement with this degree. She spent 5 years, over $100,000 in debt. Not a single law enforcement agency in the Chicagoland area would recognize that degree. Was she ever told that along the way with all those fancy ads? Never. So I say to students, think twice about these for-profit schools. But I want to say a word about one particular instance that bothers me a lot. Corinthian was one of the largest. Most people didn't know Corinthian as a for-profit school, but they knew some of the schools that were involved in them. Everest College. Everest colleges were sponsored by Corinthian. Well, it turned out that Corinthian ran into a problem. Corinthian colleges was falsifying information that they gave to the federal government. The federal government asked Corinthian College, like it asks all these other for-profit colleges, how many of your students get jobs after they graduate? Corinthian was falsifying the students getting jobs. In fact, Corinthian had this arrangement with many companies. They would give them $1,000 and say, can you hire our graduates for a month? You can let them go, but hire them after graduation for a month or two. We'll give you some money to do it. Well, the companies went along with that, subsidized employees, then they let the employees go. And then Corinthian would report to the federal government, our graduates all are working. Well, when we called them on it and they couldn't produce the real information, Corinthian stock started plummeting and eventually went out of business. It was more than a year ago that I wrote the Department of Education asking them to investigate Corinthian colleges about falsifying job placement rates. It was originally reported by the Huffington Post. Well, according to the department, they looked into it. Corinthian was, in fact, lying, falsifying placement rates and grade and attendance records at several of its institutions. Corinthian would use inflated placement rates to lure other unsuspecting students into the school. After the Department of Education placed financial sanctions on the company and delayed their Title IV disbursements, Corinthian reported they didn't have cash flow and would have to close. That's exactly what happened. Unfortunately, the Department of Education kept the school afloat even after this, shoveling hundreds of millions of dollars to the failed Corinthian company, allowing it to continue advertising and signing up students. At a point when private investors were jumping ship, the Department of Education was jumping in. Now, in a transaction blessed by the Department of Education, most of the former Corinthian campuses have been sold to ECMC. This is a corporation that has served historically as a debt collector for the Department of Education. This is one of the companies that goes after students when they're not paying their student loans. Now, this debt collection agency is going to own one of these for-profit colleges, what's left of Corinthian. We're told this new debt collection university will operate as a not-for-profit entity. That was enticing. And I thought, well, at least they're not in the for-profit world. Despite being a not-for-profit company in name at least, I'm troubled that ECMC is already, just weeks into owning and operating these schools, failing to live up to the promises they made to the students and to me. Here's an example. I wrote ECMC's head, David Hahn, in December, asking him to discontinue Corinthian's use of mandatory arbitration clauses as part of the school's enrollment agreement. What are these clauses? These clauses signed by students take away the rights of students to bring grievances before a court. And once students end up in arbitration proceedings, they find the rules stacked against them and in favor of the corporate repeat players. The associations represent not-for-profit schools, and they've informed me that their member schools do not use the mandatory arbitration clauses. These clauses are essentially only used by companies in the for-profit college sector. I told Mr. Hahn that if he was truly going to run a not-for-profit institution, he should allow the clear model nonprofit education, no mandatory arbitration clauses for students. In his response to me, Mr. Hahn certainly said the right things. He told me that ECMC, quote, had eliminated Corinthian's policies of binding mandatory arbitration, end of quote. The reason this is important is if a student has been defrauded and they sign one of these mandatory arbitration clauses, they can never get their case and their facts before an impartial jury or a judge. It's going to be decided in an arbitration hearing instead. Mr. Hahn summed up their policy on the issue as, quote, bottom line, we believe students have an unquestioned right to seek redress for grievances, including the right to file a lawsuit. We will not stand in the way of any student who wants to pursue litigation based on his or her personal experiences, end of quote. Couldn't have been stated more clearly and better. It meant that this debt collection company that is taking over the failing for-profit school is saying that we are truly not-for-profit and we are truly going to play this on the square, and if students feel they've been treated unfairly, they have every legal right to go to court so they don't end up with tens of thousands of dollars of debt because we defrauded them. I felt pretty good about that response. Well, then we read the fine print. You find out ECMC uses a combination of carrots and sticks to try to keep students out of court. First, ECMC's new enrollment document requires students to irrevocably waive their right to seek a trial by jury and waive their ability to join any class action lawsuit against the school. That isn't what Mr. Hahn told me was going to happen. In other words, students who are wronged by ECMC have to challenge the school alone. They've got to stand by themselves, and they can't make their court case in front of a jury. Then there are carrots. ECMC enrollment agreement does everything it can to steer students into arbitration. They offer to pay half the cost of a student's filing fee for arbitration, if and only if the student waives his or her right to appeal the arbitrator's decision to court or bring a lawsuit against the school. And if a student demonstrates hardship, for example, because the student saddled with enormous student loan debt and no job, ECMC will offer to pay the entire arbitration filing fee, but again, only if the student will forfeit their right to bring a lawsuit and the arbitrator's decision becomes binding. I see another colleague of mine on the floor here, and I know she wants to make a statement. I'll just wrap up here if I can. Meanwhile, Corinthian executives seem to be off the hook. They've faded into obscurity. They took millions of dollars in federal subsidies. They lured students into worthless schools. The students ended up with the debt and the worthless diplomas. They falsified the results of their activity to the federal government, and then they went bankrupt. They took their million-dollar salaries and faded away. What's left behind? How about all the students with all the debt for the worthless courses at the worthless school? That's the reality of the for-profit college industry, and Corinthian is Exhibit A. It doesn't appear there's any prosecution of these individuals who ran Corinthian into the ditch is likely. They've literally taken their money and they're off to some other pursuits. Maybe they're looking for some new federal subsidy that can make them rich. But the former students are left with worthless educations and more debt than they can ever repay. Students like Dawn Thompson from my state of Illinois. Dawn has a paralegal degree from Everest, part of Corinthian, never ever could find a job in her field. Over $100,000 in student loan debt to become a paralegal. How about that? Federal and private loans. She's working a minimum wage job now as a bank teller. She tried to file for bankruptcy a couple of years ago, and you guessed it, student loan debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Dawn, it's with you for your lifetime. It's one of the few debts that isn't dischargeable. Dawn Thompson felt at that point her only option was to go back to school, and it turns out the only school that would accept her credits was Everest, the original school she went to. She thought maybe a master's degree from Everest would make a difference. It did. Her student loan debt went from $100,000 to $170,000. She's still struggling to find a job. How can we stand by and let this happen? How can the federal government recognize these as real schools How can we allow students to be misled into believing these are real colleges and universities? How can we continue to give these outrageous, scandalous subsidies to these worthless companies where the CEOs are taking out millions of dollars? It's time for us to do something about this. Shame on us if we sit here and make speeches about how bad the deficit is and how much we care about struggling students and ignore the obvious. For-profit colleges and universities as an industry is basically an industry that needs to be thoroughly investigated, carefully monitored, and most of their players need to go out of business, not at the expense of the students. 10% of the students, 20% of the federal aid to education, 46% of student loan defaults from for-profit colleges and universities. It's time for the Senate, when it reauthorizes the Higher Education Act, to change this. Mr. President, I yield the floor.